Hi, I'm Mel Todd, and I wanted to tell you about the short story you're about to listen to called Eye of the Beholder. I was approached by Three Ravens Press asking if I was interested in doing an anthology called Trailer Park. The entire idea was what would you do if aliens, zombies, whatever attacked? And this was my take on it. Granted, it's a little weird because, well, I'm me and I usually do weird stories, but I really hope you enjoy my take on what a redneck would do when everything goes crazy. Again, my story is called Eye of the Beholder, and I really hope you enjoy. And don't be scared to check out the information in the video to see about the rest of the anthology and the other stories that are in it.
Eye of the Beholder by Mel Todd. Adam, here are the reports you wanted, the attack coordinator began. The aerial scouts have finished their reports, and our shamans have isolated areas that have abundant supplies of water, wood, and plants to harvest. There are some animals, and the indigenous species is not as prevalent in this area as others. Chalice looked up from the data of how many had died of starvation this month, pushing platinum tendrils of hair out of his face. He sighed at the numbers and the lack of options. Is there any information as to the edibility of the plants? The samples returned by the aerials vary. Some were lacking most nutrients. The few pieces of what look like tree fruit or tree seeds have a tolerable taste, but little that we need. However, there were 3 plants that taste like the food of the gods, and our shamans say if we can come back with seeds, it would grow here. That is wonderful news. Chalice frowned. And the indigenous? His coordinator wrung his long, triple-jointed fingers. Dangerous in groups. They have weapons that can kill, but our scouts are faster and deadlier than they will ever be. If we attacked directly, they might win. If we raid, they will never have a chance. Which means more of our people will die, as will theirs. Chalice frowned. Our people are already dying, and we have seen how warlike they are. We have no choice. Their world is so rich, even losing a few thousand of their people will barely be noticed. Their technology is more advanced in flight and weapons, but they seem to have no knowledge of world portals, and their data methods are rudimentary. The coordinator set down chips of data. Here is another overview. Chalice closed his eyes but nodded. Send out the Hilihi and Snick. I want fear and destruction sowed. Get the indigenous species to flee the area. If they are killed, and the Snick or Hilihi don't eat them, bring back their bodies. We can study them and see if we can learn anything. As you order, Adim. The coordinator bowed twice and backed out of the office. Chalice rubbed the bridge of his nose and hoped the scouts could clear out the area fast. Kill the current populace or scare them. It didn't matter to him. He just needed to be able to send in raiding parties to collect as much as they could, and too many of his raiders were men who had never fought an organized battle. Their crops had started failing. Then famine, followed by floods, had swept through his region, leaving his people desperate. Desperate people didn't really care about anything except survival. On the other side of the compound, the scoutmaster opened the pens where the Hilihi and Snick were held. Out! You have your keep to earn. He cracked the long whip he always carried. It cracked across the backs of the beasts that slinked out of the 2 sets of pens. They swirled around each other, snarling and yipping as the whip cut through fur. You know the orders. Go in, kill, scare. Get them to leave that area. Anything you kill you are free to eat. Make sure you do. There won't be any food here for you. Count yourself lucky. If you do well, maybe We won't eat your children." Pairs of beasts lifted furred and whiskered heads, watching him, eyes dark with hate. "Or die on that strange planet. I don't care. You know the price if you don't come back," he snarled, the whip cracking at the pen that held their cubs. Shoulders hunched, they nodded as one and turned to look at the portal forming. At the command, they flowed through, silent, furred hulks, breathing in air that didn't reek of despair. Cam stretched to her full 6'2" height, bucket of blackberries lifted high in the air. "I sure love my berry sog, but the pickin's a chore," she muttered in a soft southern drawl. Her wheat blonde hair was drenched with sweat in the Georgia summer, but either she picked the berries or the animals did, and she wanted something sweet. "Another hour about do it, I wager?" Cam tilted her face to the sun, but only held it for a moment. She had chores and studying to do. A deep, growling whine from the nearby kudzu had her setting down her bucket and pulling out the 1911 strapped to her hip. She had extra bullets in her overalls, but the 1911 served to scare away most predators, be they on 2 legs or 4. "Hello?" she called out, sharp blue eyes scanning the area. Another whine that, for all the world, sounded like a cry for help. Moving over to the kudzu, she knelt down, expecting to see maybe a fox or, worst case, a coyote injured under the green leaves. While bears were occasionally seen up here in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, she'd never had any of them do more than wander across her front yard. And if someone was poaching bears, then not killing them, she'd be having a talk with them. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I might be able to help." She spent her life patching up her brother and other animals. It was the reason she was studying to get her vet tech certification. Nothing better she could think of than working with animals. Much better than people. With the 1911 ready, safety off, in her right hand, she pulled away the draping kudzu with her left and froze. "Holy smokes, what in God's name are you?" She breathed out the words as she stared into 2 sets of beautiful purple eyes. "I ain't never seen nothing like you. You heard, darling?" A soft mule of agreement, and Cam felt her heart tumble. She had never fallen in love. She'd never even had a date. Men didn't like girls like her. They liked girls like Susie May, her cousin. Or at least that's what her good-for-nothing brother Bobby Joe liked to remind her. "Well, come on now, darling. I'll see what I can do." She flipped the safety on and backed up, never taking her eyes off the impossible creature. Cam knew, as the creature emerged, chewing on a kudzu leaf with apparent pleasure, that she'd never fall in love more than she just had. As the Georgia sun struck the beast, Cam didn't know whether to sing with joy — she had a passable singing voice — or cry with rage. The size of a large tiger, it had 4 eyes, each a rich purple. 2 faced forward and 2 were on the sides of its head. Tall, tufted ears with antennae waving on each side, built like a mix between a cat and a dog. The structure reminded her more of the pictures of some of the big animals from the Natural History Museum. Its fur was the color of dusk, not gray, but not black, a blue-gray, brown that she'd never see outside of the sky. It had a muzzle like a cat, but the claws, the very big and scary claws, remained extended as it crawled out. But all of that paled at the lash marks across its back. Cam had seen enough damage from animal attacks and human to recognize a weapon versus a claw, and these had been made by a weapon. Even worse, maggots had grabbed onto the exposed flesh and were gobbling away. "Oh, darling, I can help, but it will hurt. Ain't much I can do about that," she said, looking at the creature. "I don't know what you are, but ain't no one need to suffer like that." The creature gave her a long, hard look, then closed its eyes and sunk claws into the ground. Huh, well, what do you know? Cam stared at the creature and those claws. Wild animals weren't good about pain, and they sure as heck didn't understand people. But this wasn't any animal she'd ever seen. Fuck it, ain't letting no creature walk around with maggots on it. She pulled off her pack and dug out her first aid kit. While it wasn't one made for animals, it would have to do. Something this big, it had to weigh upwards of 100 pounds, wasn't something she could carry home to treat. You're so beautiful, you know that? You escaped from a zoo or a lab somewhere? Cam kept up her soothing chatter as she flicked off the maggots with her knife. The creature just lay there, not purring, but calmer than Cam would have ever expected from a wild animal, even one she'd never seen nor heard of before. But then she'd only gotten her associate's degree before she had to quit, so she figured there was a lot of stuff in this world she didn't know about. But she knew this creature was hurting. Okay, this is going to sound funny, but I don't got no way to stitch you up and nothing to make it not hurt. She checked the wound again, deep but not actively bleeding. So I'll use some glue to close you up. It's going to sting like the devil, so don't go hurting me none, 'kay? The creature, it wasn't a cat nor a wolf, so she couldn't come up with a better word, looked at her over its shoulder and nodded before burying its face in the kudzu it was gnawing on. I swear you almost understand me. Dangdest thing. She refused to think about a predator eating kudzu, though she did worry about it having an upset stomach. Okay, darling, hold on. Cam had her super glue out, and after she carefully cleaned each wound, she pulled them together and held them until the glue set. It took a while, but the creature only whined a few times, then kept busy gnawing on the kudzu. When she finished, you could see the marring, but it looked like a warp in the fur pattern, not a possibly life-threatening injury. Well, there you go. Now I wish I could convince you to take it easy, and definitely no licking. It stopped from where it had been about to lick the area and hunched down. You wouldn't like the taste, nohow. The shadows had gotten long, and Cam stood stretching her back. I've got to get going. Wish I knew where you belong, but for now, be careful, you hear? It nodded again, sitting on its haunches. Well, I never. Cam just grinned. She grabbed her bucket of berries and slowly started backing out, never taking her eyes off the creature. There was being insane, treating a wounded wild animal, and being stupid. Turning your back on a wounded wild animal qualified as stupid. She glanced behind her once. When she swirled her head back to look at the mysterious creature, it had disappeared. Cam stood there for a long time, then headed home, quiet and listening for anything about to pounce. She spent the next 2 days studying and trying to find that creature on the net, but while she was getting high 80s on the practice exam, she couldn't find nothing on the beauty she treated. Lost in thoughts about how strange the creature's physiology had been, the noise of 2 sets of tires driving up pulled her out of her musing. Jesus bless, I don't need this today, she muttered, and stood out on the porch of her daddy's house, watching her uninvited visitors. When her parents died, they left the 2-room log cabin in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains to her. They left her brother the house in the city and most of the money. Cam didn't hold it against them. No one thinks they'll die when their kids are barely out of high school. But she got the house her daddy's ma grew up in, and it suited her just fine. Bobby Joe got the house and the fancy college degree. Too bad that boy wanted her to be just like the bimbos he'd dated, or worse, like Susie May. That weren't ne'er going to happen. Her cousin didn't have the common sense that God gave a squirrel, but she had a figure that made an hourglass blush. Cam knew she didn't have any figure besides that of a rectangle, but She was pretty certain she had more common sense than most men, something that she was sure would be proved again today. With a feeling of doom, she watched her brother and Reverend get out of their cars. The two men nodded at each other as they made their way up her paved drive. Cam set herself at the top of the steps, blocking the way up. If she was lucky, they'd say their piece and leave before she got too annoyed. "Afternoon," she said, her voice loud in the quiet afternoon. "Now, Camilla, aren't you going to invite us up for tea?" the Reverend coaxed, his too big smile and sparkling eyes as always giving her the heebies. "Really, Cam, that ain't how a lady's supposed to treat guests," Bobby chided, and Cam narrowed her eyes. "No, but I figured shooting you with rock salt 'cause your trespassing might be a bit extreme. This ain't a bad compromise." She crossed her arms. She'd bet $3 Bobby Joe was here to try to get her to sell the property, and the Reverend was here to get donations for his latest pet project. "Camilla Jones, that isn't any way to treat a servant of the Lord. Your ma would be mighty sorrowful about your actions," Reverend Aaron Hayworth protested. "I'm just here looking for time or donations to our mission to Kenya. We sure could use a strong woman like you to help with the fair we're organizing." My ma would have held her tongue like any good Christian woman, and she'd have helped until her feet hurt so bad Pa would be massaging them for hours. Pa, however, would have kicked you off the property. You know he didn't hold with missions, saying you should be ministering to the people here first. Besides, you just want me to come out and do the grunt labor that the rest of the congregation is weaseled out of. She didn't move from her stance, leaning across the entrance to her porch. If either of them sat down, they'd be here for hours. And she needed to study, darn it. "Cam, that ain't no way to talk to a man doing God's work. It's just more proof that living out here by yourself like is making you— I swear to Jesus, Bobby Joe, if you say uppity, I'm coming off this porch and testing some of my hog-tying techniques on you." Cam straightened up, narrowing her eyes and taking one step down. Bobby held up his hands and took a step back. "I'm just saying you might want to be a little sweeter. Look at Susie May. She's got fellas asking her out every night." Cam's temper flared. She wanted her certification, to get a good job and not be a single mom in a double-wide like half her family. "She sure does." Her accent got thicker when her dander went up. "She's got them after her like she's a bitch in heat, and she's about as picky. Now, unless you got some reason to be here, both of you get." She knew she should calm down, but right now she was really thinking about grabbing that double-aught and peppering their asses with rock salt. "Cam, I'm just trying to look out for you. I got a great offer for this old place, enough that you could get out of this dump and live closer to the city, and you would haven't to risk this place falling down around you. See, Camilla, Bobby Joe's a good brother to you." Cam felt her blood boil. She'd reshingled the roof by herself. The porch was brand new, and she'd built it. The path to the house was paved with stones she'd dug out of the river herself. All the plumbing was updated, and she loved this one-bedroom cabin. "I think you boys ought to take yourselves out of here. Afraid my patience is darn well spent." "Now, Camilla Jones," the Reverend said, at the same time as Bobby Joe started speaking. "Cam, it's better for you." A loud growl came from the azaleas she had planted along the creek bank. The bushes shook like something huge was in there. "Bear!" Bobby yelped and went scurrying back to his shiny Escalade, while the Reverend went whiter than her night shift and backed up to his town car. Both men slammed the doors as something huge and furry peeked out. "I'll call animal control," yelled the Reverend as both men peeled out, leaving dust in their wake. "Crap, I don't need no bear sniffing around here. I can't afford to be buying new doors 'cause the bear decides he wants my fish." Cam took 2 steps backwards and grabbed her .30-06, not the double-aught that held nothing but rock salt. The cars disappeared down her gravel road. Cam hoped they both got dings on their paint jobs before she shifted her attention to the bush, rifle ready to snap up. There weren't a lot of bears in this area, but it could happen, though not when there was so much food available in the woods. As soon as the motor of the car faded, the rustling increased, and Cam got her rifle ready. A familiar, fuzzy, four-eyed purple creature stuck its head out of the bush and looked at her. "Well, I'll be. How'd you find me, darling?" She lowered the gun and watched the impossible creature come out. The wounds on its back were still sealed. It slowly moved up to the steps and whined a bit. "I still don't know what you are, but you're awfully smart. What are you doing here, besides rescuing me?" The creature, she needed to give it a name, really. She'd think on that. But it whined at her and gazed at the gully. The gully flooded in the winter and dried in the summer, but it acted as an impromptu wall on one side, so she never much minded it. From that gully came another thing. "Oh my," was all Cam could manage. Where her purple tiger was sleek and almost elegant, this was like a mini rhino with fur and fangs. It reminded her of a drawing she'd seen in some of the more fanciful ideas of hell. This would make a good hellhound, except for the damn bear trap on one bleeding, swollen foot. "Damn Ben Jenkins and his traps! That man never picks them up, and we ain't had no bear attacks in years. But at this rate, there's going to be a man wearing his traps if this keeps up. Now, you just wait here." She shook her finger at both animals, then trotted over to her garage. It wasn't even big enough to hold a compact car, much less her truck, though she daydreamed about a motorcycle. But it was organized and had every tool she'd claimed from the house and whatever had been left up here. "There," she said, grabbing a crowbar and a pair of gloves. A minute later, she was standing about 2 feet from the creature, admiring it. Ugly as hell, but she could see it would be strong and fast, though it didn't follow any of the rules her veterinary books talked about. She also stopped inside the house and got her pet med kit. Maybe it would let her help before running off. On the off chance it might let her brush it, that fur needed brushing in the worst way, she grabbed a brush. Some of the local dogs would come over just to let her brush them. She swore as soon as she was through with school, she'd get a dog and a cat. The two creatures were where she had left them, the purple tiger standing guard over the hulking rhino dog. Cam shook her head. She'd have to see if she could get pics, but first she needed to get that trap off its paw. Cam knelt next to the rhino dog and looked at it. "This may hurt, so please don't go biting off my head or arm or anything, 'kay?" She swore the purple tiger snorted, but it just watched the area around them. There weren't many bird or squirrel sounds, which didn't surprise her. Part of her wanted to run and hide from these two. They looked scary and dangerous, but she'd never been able to resist an animal in pain. She tugged the gloves on and, using the crowbar to brace one side, she pushed down on the other, grunting. "That man doesn't take care of nothing he owns. Darn thing is as rusty as can be." She got it clear of the beast's paws. "Okay, pull your paw out now," she murmured, all too aware of its teeth and their proximity to her neck. But she didn't realize just how close they were until she'd closed the trap and sat back. Cam looked up into a mouth full of fangs and molars and felt her desire to deck the creature flood up. "You might want to step back a bit. You're too close." Mostly she was talking to herself, trying to remember it was just an animal and didn't understand how humans viewed large amounts of teeth. To her amazement, the beast huffed and hobbled back 2 steps. A shaky breath escaped her. "Thanks. Now, you want me to look at that?" The rhino dog looked at her purple tiger, which nodded. The beast sat on its hind haunches, exposing that it was very male, and held the injured paw out to Cam. "Well, I'll be. You two sure are smart. Let's take a look-see." She grabbed the med kit, then his paw. To her relief, it didn't look like the bones were broken. The skin was bruised under the fur, and it probably hurt like the dickens, but it wasn't broken. She stared at her med kit, thinking, I'm going to wrap it in this ace bandage. It'll give you some support, but should fall off in a day or two, or your teeth can pull it off, no issue. Cam glanced at them, but they just looked at her, the paw still hanging in midair. Huh, something else, I'll tell you. With brisk but gentle movements, she wrapped the paw, then looked at his coat. It was longer and heavier than the tiger's fur. She was pretty sure it was reddish-brown, maybe like an Irish setter, but it had so much filth coating it. She saw ribs on both of them. Seeing ribs on animals meant they were underfed, especially through coats like that. Tell you what, I got some offal from a few rabbits I shot that I ain't disposed of yet. You can eat that, and I can brush the two of you out, see if there's anything else worrying you. 2 sets of ears perked up, one long and pointy with tufts, the other round and thick like satellite dishes. Cam laughed with sheer joy and headed back in. There wasn't anything in the world she liked as much as animals. They didn't put hands where hands weren't invited, and they never criticized her about why she wasn't what they thought she should be. A minute later, she was out with a bowl of offal. In theory, she was going to make some gravy from it, but she'd been avoiding the messy cleaning up and processing of it to study. Then Bobby Joe and Reverend, so this was as good a use for it as any. Ain't much, but it might help. Kind of funny you chewing on that kudzu. Stuff is edible, I guess, but definitely not my first choice. Cam set it between them, and it was gone in 2 bites, 1 each. Sorry, kiddos, that's all I got. But I can try to keep extra around. She settled herself down on the bottom step, legs spread and brush ready. There might also have been the shovel she's used to dig up potatoes that morning within arm's reach. So, who's first? The words had barely left her lips before Rhino's body was between her legs, almost squirming. She had to go up 1 step because he was big enough his back was at her head level on the first step. Anxious, are you? She grinned and started off slowly, and the beast moaned. Cam froze. It sounded like a fancy musical instrument you'd hear in a concert where you had champagne, not beer. He turned and looked at her, his eyes the amber of a tiger. It was such an obvious don't stop, she giggled and began to groom him with enthusiasm. He sang to her the entire time. It was like having her own concert with music she'd ne'er imagined. His coat was a rich brown red with dark mottling to it, almost as if he had natural camouflage in the patterns. It explained why he'd disappeared into the bushes. Oh, yes, you're a good boy. But come on, Rhino, it's Twilight's turn now. Both animals looked at her, and she shrugged. I like My Little Pony. You're purple, hence Twilight. And you look like somewhere in your ancestry there's a rhino. So unless you want to tell me your names, you're stuck with those. Now come on, be a good boy, let Twilight in. Rhino sang, the mournful sound, but moved and flomped on the grass, rolling, messing up all her work. Cam just laughed. Typical animals. Get them groomed and pretty, and all they wanted to do is roll around. Twilight moved between her legs and sat a massive head on her leg, eyes closing. Damned if I can figure out what you are, beside gorgeous. She began to groom, and the purr Twilight let out vibrated through her body. It felt like her soul was realigned as she sat there in the dusk and brushed the strange beast. She had just finished the tale when both animals jerked their heads up and looked to the depths of the mountains. Their shoulders slumped, and they stood, walking to the edge of the gully. One last glance back at Cam, then they disappeared into the gathering shadows. I swear I hope those two are okay, Cam sighed, and went to finish prepping the rabbits and figuring out how to avoid her brother and the Reverend until they'd forgotten the strange bear. Twilight and Rhino flowed back through the dusk. The offal had been excellent, fortified with the vines that carried nutrients almost gone in their world. They stopped and got a few more mouthfuls of it, hiding it in their cheeks before slipping back through the portal. "Report!" barked the scoutmaster, and the two animals cringed, making them look smaller than they were. "What happened to you? Why are your coats brushed?" The scoutmaster strode out from behind the feed bins. "What did you find there? Have you achieved your objectives?" "Yes, scared away. Ate livestock. Found vines," Rhino responded, straining to hide Twilight in his shadow. "And your coats? Are you consorting with those we must kill?" Twilight and Rhino froze, not sure how to answer this. "You two, get these creatures in their pens. No food until I figure out what is going on. Account for all the beasts. I'll be crossing over to inspect their actions myself." Cringing, Twilight and Rhino let themselves be dragged while their packs howled and cried. 20 were still out in the wonderful place, but their cubs were still here in pens, crying for their parents. Locked up once more, close enough to smell but not touch, Twilight carefully spat the vine she'd packed in her cheeks over to pack members who had been punished longer than her. They ate slowly while she looked at the opening to freedom. If they could get free. Her mind drifted to the strange one, the one with kind words and touch. She had feared the wounds would fester and she would die far from her cubs and mate, but instead she received tenderness and caring. Twilight couldn't remember ever receiving that from anyone, not Pack. More lashes and whimpers of pain, but they had learned not to fight back. Any measure of resistance, and you were killed and fed to your pack, who ate because they knew, from bitter experience, they would get no other food. She longed to talk to Rhino, and wasn't that an odd name for her mate? But all scoutmasters could hear the speech. So they waited as others slunk back, many with information, and most with food packed in their cheeks. Twilight counted their numbers again. So few. She looked at the bleak sky and thought of the lushness on the other side. Maybe. Shifts changed, and she purposefully rolled in the dirt to muss up her fur as she listened to the plans. The scout that had seen them had not passed on any information, so their indiscretion had not been noted. 2 changes of shifts as more scouts came in and were shoved into cages. A small chain was formed to move the snuck-in vines to the pair nearest the cubs. They shared what they had managed to sneak in, as not even the cubs were being fed. Not that the keepers had much more food. Twilight chafed, but there was nothing they could do. Not here, where every word could be overheard. But for the first time in a generation, she felt a spark of hope. Cam had successfully avoided both her brother and his desire to get her to sell his house, but the Reverend had talked her into doing 3 hours of manning the booth with Susie May, selling raffle tickets. Oh well. Susie May would sell 10 times what she did and spend the entire time telling Cam she'd only be pretty if. With a snort of annoyance, Cam hiked through the woods, hunting for some edible mushrooms, more berries, or to see if any of her rabbit traps had snagged a meal or two. There was a weird, low-pitched buzzing off towards one of the dry creek beds that had dried up after a landslide had shifted one of the river tributaries. But no one had really cared back then. "I really hope they ain't trying to set up another rave site. Ain't no place near enough to draw power." That had happened before, and the idiots had lugged in a generator and darn near burned down the mountain. Hefting her harvesting bag up, she headed that way, just in case. Fire sucked for everyone. There was a bunch of shouting in a language she didn't recognize, which didn't mean much. She could order a beer in Spanish, but that topped out her languages. The words and sounds got louder, and one of them made her frown. She'd spent enough time around her brother's friends being show-off assholes that she knew the sound of a whip cracking. She crouched and moved through the shrubs to where the noise was coming from. She knew how to be quiet when she wanted to. On her hands and knees, she peered through the bushes, still expecting to see a bunch of teenagers or stupid college kids setting up to drink too much beer and play their music so loudly it became a wash of noise, not notes. She scanned the clearing, but there wasn't a bunch of kids. It took her a second to see the man standing there, and her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, at least 6'3", with no shirt, so she could see the muscles rippling over his chest and stomach. His thick, silvery hair was caught back at the base of his neck. His face looked like it was chiseled out of marble, as his skin all but glowed in the summer sun. She felt her body flash with sudden interest. Then the whip flashed up and back down on what had to be a pack-mate of twilight, cutting into fur that looked like it hadn't ever seen a brush. Every emotion in her body went from interest to rage so deep that her vision tinged red. Cam was up and charging like a linebacker before he could get the whip back up to strike the cowering animal again. She hit him like he was Lester Johnson, who, in 8th grade, had pulled her top off in class, displaying her Hello Kitty bra to everyone. Cam rarely forgave anything. The man went flying with a startled oof, and Cam sprang up as soon as they quit rolling from her attack. "I don't know who you are, mister, but round here we don't take to people beating animals," she snarled as she stood, ready to teach him exactly what being beaten felt like. The man stood, and her eyes widened. His attractiveness had vanished when she saw him whipping that creature, which obviously had not been trying to attack. But she hadn't expected eyes with horizontal pupils, ears that were almost flat holes against his skull, and an extra thumb on each hand. "Jump in Jehoshaphat, what are you?" The man spat a stream of syllables at her and lunged with the whip. Cam reached out and caught it, expecting him to overpower her. He had at least 2 inches on her, and looked like he spent more time working out than working, but his arm stopped moving. "I don't think so. Ain't no one gonna beat any creature while I'm here," she warned. He spat more syllables, tugging at his arm, but she held it. Not with ease, but the big dogs in the kennel gave her more problems. A fist swung at her face, and she dropped her arm to block, then came back with a haymaker of her own. Cam had never done well with the girly stuff, and by God, if you were going to swing at her, she'd hit back. He missed her by a Coke bottle. She didn't. He crumpled to the ground and didn't move. "What in the world?" Cam stared at the unconscious man, or monster, or maybe alien. She didn't really know, but a soft woof pulled her to look at the beast behind her. The fur was a lighter shade of purple than twilight, and only one of the lashes had broken the skin, but she had no doubt it was the same type of creature as Twilight. "Oh my," she whispered, as she looked past the creature into a ripple that didn't display the North Georgia mountains, but instead something out of a big movie production. She moved a bit closer, peering in. The air coming out of this portal thingy smelled and tasted stale and dry. The land was red and dusty, looking like it was from some place in Africa, and maybe she would have believed that, if not for the reddish sun in the sky and the broken moon hanging next to it. Scattered on the surface of this ugly place were tents, metal buildings, pens, and people scurrying to and fro. But no kids, no smiles, and everyone looked like they were waiting for a whip to come down on their backs. "What in the world?" "It is my world. We are planning on invading." A soft voice spoke in her mind, with weird pauses and a flavor to words that made no sense. Cam found herself sitting on her rump, staring at the beast. Did you just talk to me? The more stressed she got, the heavier her accent, and she didn't think she'd ever had as many shocks before in her life. You are the one that helped Thinks Like Wind? Cam blinked at the being and swallowed past a suddenly dry mouth. If you mean Twilight, well, yeah. Her and Rhino needed some care is all. The beast tilted its head, looking at her. They have our cubs. They keep them, hurt them, to make sure we obey. It was odd. There was no anguish in the words, no begging for sympathy, just a flat statement that threatened to tear Cam's heart out. Now that ain't right. Ain't right to be holding chillins as leverage. Cam avoided most politics, but she knew all too well the evils of the Department of Family Services. How they'd step in and just take kids just 'cause they had some dirt or a bruise or two. Kids played and got dirty and hurt. It was called being kids. Cam glanced over at the alien man lying on the ground, but he didn't rouse, though his chest rose and fell regularly. She'd take that as a good thing. Cam crawled under a bush near the portal and stared at the other world. Her overall impression was red and dust, but now she paid attention to the layout of the town. But it wasn't, not really. It reminded her more of the little cities that sprang up around rodeos. Everyone had their horses and shared pens, and there was always some guy bitching at another about parking in his spot. Not a town, but a few permanent buildings that the fairgrounds owned. But the rushing around and patterns screamed military to her more than rodeo, which was too bad. An alien rodeo might have been kind of neat. You're invading us? Yes, we are scheduled to attack tomorrow. Huh, Cam muttered, still watching. Don't you have females? I am what you call a female in that I carry live young in me for a period of time. The voice sounded so matter-of-fact, not anywhere near as confused, excited, or terrified as Cam felt. I meant them. No women? Even at rodeos, you'd have girls about. They were just as horse-crazy as guys. They are regarded as too weak. Women are fragile, and they do not let them go to war. They take care of the children. The creature lay next to her, and it smelled of burnt apple wood, an unusual smell. But Cam was much too busy processing what she had said. And you can't be free until you rescue your cubs? We will not risk our children. This time, there was a bit of a growl in the words, and Cam smiled as she looked back at the guy laying on the ground, still not moving. Perfect. Can you tell the rest of you that we'll get your cubs free, but you'll have to help us. If you free our cubs, we'll be yours for life. Meh. We don't hold with the idea of slavery none. We'll figure it out. There wasn't anything right about doing this to animals, much less people, and by her reckoning, if you could talk, you were people. What time tomorrow? The creature lifted her head to the sky, then at the portal. I believe before your sun is above the tree line, but that might be wrong. No worries. I got this, Sparkle. You gonna be okay if I skedaddle? I got plans to make. The beast looked at the downed man, then back at Cam. Sparkle. A weird chuff. I will play injured. He will believe it. Good. And you're a beautiful girl, Sparkle. Believe that, okay? With that parting, Cam moved back out of the way, grabbing her stuff, and disappeared into the undergrowth, leaving the strange being behind. But she had a plan, and she'd be damned if it wouldn't work. 20 minutes later, she was back at the house and had everything she needed. She reached down and pulled out her secret weapon, the church phone book for the Ladies' Auxiliary. Everyone knew they ran the whole town, and she'd kept in their good graces by working the church festivals. Ma had been the secretary for 3 terms. She had paid her dues and was calling it in, and she'd be starting with her Aunt Maribel, Susie May's ma. Auntie Maribel? She kicked her breath up a bit. Maribel couldn't resist running to the rescue for anyone, and she knew it drove her crazy that Cam had never needed rescuing. Camilla, what is wrong? Anxiety laced her aunt's voice, and for a second Cam felt a sliver of guilt. But she had to rescue those animals. Besides, no Georgian was going to stand being invaded a second time. Once was enough. I hate to admit it, but I need y'all's help. All the ladies, and even the menfolk. A sharp intake of breath on the other end of the phone. Camilla, you tell me what's going on right this second. Cam had to close her eyes for a minute. That voice sounded so much like her ma's that the tears she'd been trying to fake threatened to become real. Yes'm? She thought this through carefully. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth. There's some people coming that are planning on causing some trouble here, and they're going to be hurting some pretty animals. Cam thought they were gorgeous, so it wasn't a lie. They think we're a bunch of yokels that will be easily intimidated and give them anything they want. They think we're easy marks to being invaded. Cam knew playing that card was risky. Lots of the older folks still had a knee-jerk reaction to invaders or revenuers. Made no sense to her, but she wasn't lying. Just hoped she wasn't wrong. Getting a bunch of her friends and townsfolk killed would be wrong, but calling up the army or the police or even the National Guard and say, what? Hi, I have talking animals that say some weird guys from another place are about to invade us. If she was lucky, they'd hang up on her. Worse, they might send someone to see if she was on drugs. Then what would she do? Are these foreigners? Maribel asked, her voice going hard. Yes'm, they're from some place totally different than Georgia, not even this continent. Stupid foreigners, always thinking they can come here and do whatever they want. We'll show 'em. Southerners take pride in our hospitality, but don't think you can ruin things and not pay consequences. Just tell me when and where, child, and I'll make sure everyone is there. Cam had forgotten about the bunch of illegals, from Russia of all places, that had squatted in a house and totally destroyed it. Maribel would never forgive any foreigner for destroying a house on the historic register. Thanks, Auntie Maribel. Tell them to come loaded. They'll have weapons, but I'm not sure what, Cam said slowly, the gravity of what she was doing registering. Sweet child, you don't get to be my age without knowing how to fight. We'll be there, and any foreigners that think about hurting animals and invading our lands is in for a rude awakening. Now get going, child. Call your brother. I got women to call. Before Cam could even reply, Maribel had hung up the phone, and Cam knew if she called back the line would be busy. Maribel didn't believe in these fancy new cell phones. Steeling herself, she called Bobby Joe. Hello, sister of mine. You ready to sell that old place? Cam rolled her eyes. The first words out of his mouth were that. How much was someone offering him? Whatever. It didn't matter right now. I need your help. Got some people planning on coming out behind my place tomorrow and causing problems. They've been scoping the place out and are planning on doing an invasion thing. A home invasion on my sister? I don't think so. What time are they going to be there? His voice had snapped from wheedling good old boy to hard and decisive. Do they know you're alone? I don't think they expect anyone to stop them, and they've got a bunch of animals they've been mistreating too. I found out roughly what time they'll be here tomorrow. Dogfighting? Now that's just wrong. Me and the boys will be there tomorrow. How many you think are coming? Cam chewed on her lip. Well, they've got about 30 animals penned, but I don't think more than 100 or so. She wasn't positive, but the camp hadn't been that big. Those assholes won't know what hit 'em. I'll be there. You make sure your shotgun is loaded and door locked. You sure you don't want to come stay in town? He sounded concerned, and Cam's heart softened a bit. Nah, I'm good. Going to load my shotgun with slugs, and I'll be ready if anyone does. They talked a minute more, giving him the location details before he hung up. She stood there for a long time, planning. As she was the only one who had any idea what they'd be facing, it was up to her to be prepared for everyone. Cam was up and moving before the sun crested the Blue Ridge Mountains to the east. She lugged 2 huge duffel bags and her shotgun with her. She'd spent the day getting ready, and she'd done everything she could think of. But if the aliens had blaster rifles or something, they were screwed. Then she'd be calling 911 and the FBI or ATF. ATF wasn't good for much, but if you reported you'd found an active still, they showed up faster than a goose pooped. She put the bags down in the brush and opened one of them up, pulling out 2 plastic grocery bags full of brown, round objects. Cam had started to collect them for a craft project she never quite got around to starting, no matter how often she told Aunt Maribel that she'd have it before Thanksgiving. For the last 3 Thanksgivings. But sweet gum tree seeds would work just as well as anything else and give her animals a reason to avoid that area. Stepping on them hurt. With quick movements, time was running out, she covered the area where the last portal had appeared with the seed pods, then scrambled back into the covering. I really hope she was right about the timing, Cam muttered as she heard people coming up through the mountains. She scooted back out from under the bushes and moved to intercept. There was an old logging road that came up below the clearing, and Cam figured that was where most people would drive up. Even being quiet, cars made a shit ton of noise, and she glanced back, hoping the portal hadn't formed yet. "Shush! Y'all sound like a pack of hogs rampaging round here," she ordered in a low growl as she looked at the people showing up. Bobby Joe looked around with the Reverend and Aunt Maribel right behind him. "Well, Camilla, we're here. Where are these invaders you've been talking about?" "Well, if you don't keep your voice down, they're gonna hear you. So maybe shush your mouth before you ruin everything." Cam had to fight not to shout. Shouting at her brother just came naturally. "Now, Camilla, is that any way to talk to your brother?" the Reverend protested, looking affronted on her brother's behalf. "Now, she can talk to her brother any way she wants, but Camilla, couldn't you dress a bit cuter? Look at how Susie May is dressed, cute and practical." Cam glanced over at her cousin and sighed. Susie May, with her curvy figure and great chest, was dressed in form-fitting camo cargo pants, a top tied at the waist and a hunting vest over it. She looked adorable, especially with her compound bow and quiver of arrows. Cam still wore her overalls, had her 1911 on her hip and a shotgun strung across her back with her hair in a ponytail. "Right now, that ain't what's important. We've got invaders to deal with." Cam saw more and more people coming and swallowed at how many of the townsfolk came. "Wow, everyone came out." Maribel crossed her arms and glared at her. "Girl, I think you dress horribly and that you need a man to treat you like a queen. But don't think we don't recognize how hard you've worked. Your mama and daddy would be right proud of you." She cast a look at Bobby Joe. "You need to work on being a better human." Cam felt the heat rising in her face, and she didn't know what might have been said if she hadn't heard a strange pop and words in her head. "We are coming." "Shit, they're coming," she said, and pulled up the shotgun, spinning around. "Camilla Jones, if your mother heard you, she would wash your mouth out," snapped the Reverend, but he pulled around the rifle, crouching, as did most of the town. "Next clearing. Be careful and don't hurt none of the beasts. They're my friends. They won't attack us. But I need to get inside and rescue their cubs." "Wait, what beasts? And inside where? Camilla?" Multiple voices hissed questions at her, but Cam ignored them and headed right for the shrubs. This time she didn't crouch, but swung the duffel up on her shoulder. She'd need it on the other side. "Be careful and don't get killed." Guilt ate at her again, but she figured she'd drown it in Clyde's home brew if they lived. Hopefully, if this became an issue, they'd have proof. She reminded herself that surprise was the best weapon. With that, she burst out of the bushes, screaming the best battle cry she could think of. "Here comes Leroy J—" The rest of the word was lost as she charged the emerging aliens. "She's coming," whispered in her mind in multiple voices, multiple levels of belief. But Cam fought to keep her feet moving forward because she was scared, senseless. Out of the portal streamed 2 columns of men, all armed with long swords and a long stick with prongs on it. The aliens, all inhumanly beautiful, yet wrong, spied her. They shouted out in a language she didn't know and charged her. "Be careful, they want to kill you." That she had already figured out as she saw the snarls on their faces. It made it easier to pull up the shotgun and fire. The slug slammed into her chest and blew out the back as she chambered another round. The explosion of sound stilled the battlefield as the invaders looked at her with shock. Then they started screaming in their language and slashing at her. They were too close to use the gun, and Cam could hear her friends and family behind her cussing and sharp cracks of gunshots. Cam ducked a swing and the guy stopped, an arrow in his skull, then fell backwards. "I got you, Cam, go!" Susie May had never said sweeter words as Cam charged towards the portal. "Here, help us." There were more aliens, though on their home soil, maybe they weren't aliens. Either way, she headed towards the pens, the duffel clanging on her back. A few aliens were whipping the cat and rhino beasts that were trying to get to the pups. She had no idea what they were saying and didn't care. She charged in, yelling, "Get away from them!" Her voice a fierce roar. Cam realized she was moving fast and felt oddly light. Part of her realized gravity must be less here, but most of her was focused on the crying, tiny cubs. The whip cracked in the air, and she swung the duffel at one alien, hitting him solidly in the middle. He flew backwards like a horse had kicked him, but more were coming. She fumbled in the duffel, trying to find the big bolt cutters she'd grabbed. They'd work as well as a club right now. She grabbed one of the squirt bottles first and grinned. Taking a deep breath, she whirled and squeezed it right in the face of an oncoming attacker. A cloud of cayenne pepper blasted into his face as she stepped to the side, eyes tightly shut. He started to scream, and she headed a few steps closer to the cages, pulling the duffel with her. "What did you do to him?" a horrified voice asked in her head. Cam cracked open one eye and saw others looking at the man lying on the ground, screaming. "Huh, it worked. Spicy powder burns like crazy." The bolt cutters were now needed, and she used them, making quick work of the cages. Running around like a headless chicken, she tried to release all the beasts she could see. A scream of outrage came behind her, and she turned as a whip cracked and searing pain slashed across the left side of her face. A scream ripped from her throat as her knees gave. "Nobody hurts my sister," came a bellow from the portal, and the alien's head exploded. Then she heard the crack of Bobby's favorite .30-06. Cam forced open her eyes, but she couldn't see anything out of the left eye. Not now. She had to finish. She wanted to curl up and cry, maybe beg Susie May for some of her fun drugs, anything to make it quit hurting. Instead, she levered herself to her feet and finished. The beasts swirled around her in a wash of fur, fangs, and claws. Cubs dangled from every mouth as they ran back to the portal. Bobby Joe was standing there, watching out for them as she ran back into less mayhem than she expected. Bodies lay on the ground. Maribel stood in the middle, a baseball bat in her hand, and aliens kneeling before us. "Aunt Maribel, you okay?" Maribel looked at her and nodded sharply. "Better'n you are. Get that scene, too. Doc is over there, but we need to talk to these folks. Any ideas?" Dizzy with pain and adrenaline, Cam tried to look around. "Twilight? Rhino? Sparkle? Can you help?" Doc Reen, the local vet, came over and grabbed me. "You need to sit down, Cam. Let me look at that. Maribel here has Sheriff Glenn on the way. They'll take care of it." "Don't hurt them. They had to be rescued," she muttered as she sat. Warm fur brushed against her, and her hands found the pelt of twilight. "We won't. Trust us. We got this." Cam leaned back and closed her other eye as she heard more footsteps and discussions. She ignored all of it and focused on the feeling of Twilight's rumbles. 2 months later, Cam sat on the front porch of her house, a patch over her eye as she flipped through the college catalog. Doc Reen said he'd sponsor her to get into vet med school now that she had the money to afford it. But first, she needed her degree. She'd never thought Cam Jones would ever have a bachelor's degree. A woofing sound made her look up and smile at Rhino and Twilight laying on the front lawn, 2 adorable pup cubs at their feet. Maribel, once she had Sparkle translating for her, had identified the leader, some guy named Chalice, and cracked him open like a kid stealing cookies at church. Half the congregation almost fell over laughing when they realized the invaders were looking for kudzu and poison ivy. It hadn't taken Maribel but 15 minutes to set up a trade agreement. Cam got 5% of everything, as the portal was technically on her land, and she'd stopped the invasion. The aliens paid in rhodium, platinum, and black opals, all of which they had in abundance. In return, Maribel had a fresh, mulched, and cooked kudzu trade going, and even figured out what fertilizers they needed to get their soil revived. Apparently, they had never advanced into agriculture. Cam just let them run it. She had 2 friends that were delighted to be here. She'd passed the vet tech exam and could start working on her degree. And best of all, Bobby Joe wasn't pestering her to sell the land, and Aunt Maribel wasn't comparing her to Susie May. It totally made losing an eye worth it.